In this video, we're going to talk about leukocytes, which are also commonly known as white blood cells. So these cells are going to be different from the erythrocytes in that they're going to be much larger. They're going to contain a nucleus, they're going to contain organelles, and they're not going to be used for transport like the erythrocytes were. Instead, these cells are going to be used to protect us from pathogens. These are things that could make us sick. So like bacterial cells, viral cells, things like bacteria, viruses, things of that nature that could make us sick. So these cells are only going to spend typically a few hours in the bloodstream. There are a few that can stay in the blood longer, but for the most part, they're only going to spend a few hours in the blood, and then they're going to migrate into our connective tissues and into our lymphatic tissues, where they will kind of hang out for a much longer period of time and just kind of wait around to see if they come into contact with any pathogens in our body. So again, since they have such a different function, they're going to have a much different structure than the erythrocytes. They're going to contain nuclei, they're going to contain organelles, just like a general cell would. And so here's a microscopic image of a leukocyte, just a general white blood cell. You can see there's a large nucleus here. You've got ribosomes, which are used for protein productions in the cell, pseudopods, which help the cell move around because these are going to be moving all the time, just searching for pathogens in our body. Lysosomes, which are kind of like the stomach of the cell, is how I like to think of them. So these are used for digestion. A lot of white blood cells have the ability to phagocytose pathogens, meaning they can engulf them, bring them into their cytoplasm, and then send those pathogens to a lysosome where they can be digested or lysed or broken down and removed from the body. We also have lots of mitochondria in these cells, and those are there to produce ATP for the cell, to power it, and to allow it to be able to do what it needs to do. Now, there are a few different types of leukocytes, and so we can distinguish them or kind of group them in a few different ways by looking at their size, how many of them there are, the shape. We can also look at whether they have granules in the cytoplasm or not, as well as their functions. So when we're grouping these different types of leukocytes, we can really group them into two big categories, and those are whether they have specific granules in their cytoplasm or not. So if they have specific granules in their cytoplasm, we group them into this category called the granulocytes. And so there are three types of leukocytes that are granulocytes. We have neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And these granules are typically used as chemicals that can kind of get released by the cell to help protect us from pathogens. Monocytes and lymphocytes are two other leukocyte types. These do not contain granules in their cytoplasm. So these are grouped into the agranulocyte category, meaning they do not contain specific granules in their cytoplasm. So let's look at the granulocytes first, and we'll talk about the first group of granulocytes, which are the neutrophils. Now, neutrophils are by far the most abundant white blood cell type, and these are typically the first ones that get to a site of infection. So if you start getting an infection, like a respiratory infection, these are usually the first white blood cells that will reach that site of infection and start to clear it for you. So they are really attracted to those areas of infection or inflammation, and they're very good at phagocytosis, which means they can engulf these pathogens like these bacterial cells, bring them in, and digest them. Now, when you're trying to identify a neutrophil, the cytoplasm is typically going to be like a light purple. You'll see some very, very light granules, so you'll notice it looks kind of grainy in the cytoplasm. So they're very, very light, and then the nuclei will always be multi-lobed. So you can see this one has like 1, 2, 3, 4 lobes. This one has 1, 2, I would really call that 3, 4 as well. And so multi-lobe nuclei always, and you're always going to see these light purple granules in the cytoplasm. These are not the biggest white blood cells. They're larger than lymphocytes, but they're not going to be as big as like a macrophage or a monocyte, for instance. And so if you compare them to a red blood cell, they will be bigger than a red blood cell, but they're not going to be huge like a monocyte would. And again, they're granulocytes, right? So they have those light purple granules, which look different from the other two types of granulocytes, the eosinophils and the basophils. You guys will see what those granules look like in just a second. Again, these neutrophils, they're typically going to be the first ones to the site of infection. They can release chemicals to kill bacteria. They can engulf bacteria and digest them. When they release those chemicals, sometimes the chemicals might also cause death of themselves, right, of the neutrophils themselves or the neutrophils around them. And so these die at very high rates, and you will see tons of neutrophils in the site of an infection. So if you are testing a person to see if they have an infection, you typically do a white blood cell count, and neutrophil count is normally the one that you're looking at here, because if that neutrophil count goes up very drastically, that could indicate that you have some kind of infection going on, and that's why these neutrophils are replicating, because they're getting ready to, fight off that pathogen and get rid of it for you. Again, a lot of these neutrophils typically die during that immune response, and all of those dead neutrophils can kind of cluster up or, form aggregations in areas of infection, and that can lead to something called pus. So if you've ever seen pus or even really thick mucus, if you get like a really bad respiratory infection or something like that, a lot of times the mucus or that pus, that white color or yellow color, typically the darker the color is, the more neutrophils there are in that pus. So that just indicates that your immune system is actually doing what it's supposed to do. You have a lot of neutrophils in that area, and that's what's leading to the kind of formation of the pus in that area. So those neutrophils trying to fight off that infection. Now, eosinophils are another type of granulocyte. These are much less abundant. So if you look at these in order of abundance, I'll go ahead and give you the order of abundance of these leukocytes. The most abundant leukocyte is going to be the neutrophil. Second most will be the lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are a type of agranulocyte. We'll get to those later. Then you've got the monocytes, then you've got the eosinophils, and then you've got the basophils. So eosinophils are the second least abundant leukocyte, right? And so they're not very abundant in the blood. And if you need some help remembering that order of abundance of those white blood cells, never let monkeys eat bananas is a good way to remember that order of abundance. So never, again, neutrophils, let is your lymphocytes, monkeys is your monocytes, eat, that's your eosinophils, and then bananas is your basophils. So that's a nice little way to remember that order of abundance. But again, eosinophils are going to be the second least abundant type of white blood cell. They're typically going to have a bilobed nucleus, so just two lobes to the nucleus. And then if you look at the granules in the cytoplasm of an eosinophil, they're typically going to be a bright pink color. So eosinophils are going to look a lot different than all of the other white blood cells because of that, because you're going to see this kind of bright, hot pink or almost orange colored cytoplasm in those eosinophils. Now this cell is typically going to be used to help clear parasitic infections. So they can secrete chemicals that can help kill parasites. For example, like hookworms or tapeworms, those kinds of things. And so that's going to be their really major function. They do play a smaller role in certain allergic responses, but the main one that I want you to be familiar with is, helping to get rid of parasites. Now the basophils, this is the third type of granulocyte. Again, this is the least abundant or the rarest type of white blood cell. And these are going to look pretty unique too. So they're still going to have granules in their cytoplasm, but these granules are going to be very dark purple in color, and they're typically so dark that you almost can't see the nucleus of that basophil because the granules just kind of take over the cell. Now basophils have a couple of functions. One function is to produce histamine. Histamine is a vasodilator, meaning it causes blood vessels to widen or get larger. That can help make the flow of blood easier, right? It can allow the blood to flow faster and easier through the blood vessels, which can help increase the inflammation process, and it can increase the healing process as well. Basophils also produce heparin. Heparin is an anticoagulant, which is a fancy word for a blood thinner. So this is going to allow that blood to be thinner so that it can travel, again, more quickly through the blood vessels to help speed up inflammation and speed up the healing process. Now looking at the agranulocytes, the first group of these agranulocytes we will look at are the lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are the second most abundant or second most common type of white blood cell. And these are going to be the smallest type of white blood cell. So when you look at them next to a red blood cell, they're almost the same size. They do not have granules in their cytoplasm, but they have a very large nucleus typically. So typically an oval-shaped nucleus in these lymphocytes, and again, it's very large. It usually takes up most of the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, there are two major types of lymphocytes that we can have. We can have what are called T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, and we will talk more specifically about what those do when we get to the lymphatic system. But for now, just know that they're going to help play a role in immunity, and so they're going to be found, pretty steadily throughout your life in your bloodstream. You will have them in your lymphatic tissues too, but you will see these lymphocytes in the blood more commonly than you will see a lot of the other white blood cells. Now, the second type of agranulocyte we have are the monocytes. Monocytes are the largest type of white blood cell. They are extremely large. They have a very large nucleus, which is normally going to be kind of a kidney bean or a horseshoe-shaped nucleus. And again, these are agranulocytes, so you will not see any granules in the cytoplasm. But when you look at this cell next to a red blood cell, it is massive. It is really big. And when these monocytes hang out in your tissues for a long time, they can differentiate into an even more powerful cell called a macrophage. Macrophages are really, really large white blood cells that have very good ability to be able to phagocytose pathogens. So they can, engulf pathogens and digest them very, very easily. You typically will see these monocytes or macrophages more commonly during chronic infections, so ones that you've had for a very long period of time. These guys are kind of like the last resort. They'll come in, towards the end of a very long-term infection to really help clean up and remove any pathogens that are just lingering and that you can't, normally get rid of. Now, leukopoiesis, this is the production of white blood cells. It's going to happen thanks to the same stem cells that we had that were used for the production of erythrocytes, these hematopoietic stem cells, which again are going to be found in the bone marrow. These hematopoietic stem cells can differentiate into the myoblasts. Myoblasts can then differentiate into the three types of granulocytes, or you can have the monoblast, which differentiate into monocytes, or the lymphoblasts, which differentiate into lymphocytes. Now, the granulocytes and the monocytes typically will stay in the bone marrow until they're needed in the body, so until there's some type of infection going on, and then they'll get released. The lymphocytes will get developed in the bone marrow. Some of them will stay there to mature. Those are the B lymphocytes. The T lymphocytes, however, will get sent to the thymus, and that's where they will mature and kind of learn how to do what they need to do to be able to protect us. So the granulocytes will be able to circulate in the blood for typically just a few hours, and then they will migrate into the tissues and live for a few days. Monocytes will stay in the blood for about 10 to 20 hours, and lymphocytes, as I mentioned before, they can stay in the bloodstream for weeks up to years, and that is because lymphocytes are going to be the main cells that are going to be responsible for helping us maintain immunity to pathogens. So we need to have those available to us at all times. If you guys have any questions about the leukocytes or how to identify them, please just let me know.